The Colt Clan, 4 Generations of Darkness, June 2012. Rural New South Wales, Australia. A child welfare officer drives 3.5 hours southwest of Sydney, following up on a report about kids who haven't been to school in months. The road turns to dirt, then disappears entirely. What she finds at the end of that path will become known as the worst case of family abuse ever documented in Australian history. 40 people living in squalid tents and shacks. No running water, no electricity, no sewerage. 12 children under 16. Filthy, terrified, many unable to speak. Some deaf, some blind, some with physical deformities that shouldn't exist in the 21st century. DNA testing would soon reveal the unthinkable. 4 generations of systematic incest, beginning with a brother and sister who left New Zealand in the 1970s. This is the story of the Colt family, a clan that moved between states for 40 years, always one step ahead of authorities. A family where children were born knowing only one reality, that their father was also their uncle, that their mother was also their sister. That escape was impossible because the outside world didn't exist. When police finally discovered them in 2012, one officer would later say, "I'll never get over what I saw there." This is that story. Before we begin, this case is deeply disturbing and based on extensive court records. If you want more investigations into cases the world tried to forget, subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The discovery, early June 2012. A teacher in a small town near Boorowa, New South Wales, overhears a conversation between students in the playground. The kids are talking about a family that lives out in the bush, kids who never come to school, kids who do things families aren't supposed to do. The teacher files a report. 7. Risk of significant harm notifications reach authorities. On June 20, 2012, child welfare officers and police drive out to investigate. The property sits at the end of an old stock route, land once used by bushrangers in Australia's outlaw days. The vehicles can barely navigate the overgrown path. When they arrive, they find something that looks less like a campsite and more like a medieval settlement. Tents, shacks, rusted caravans. 40 people, men, women, children, all staring at the officers with the same expression, fear and confusion, like they've never seen strangers before. The children are the most shocking. Ages range from infants to teenagers. Most can't form complete sentences. Some communicate only in grunts. Several have fungal infections covering their skin. Their clothing is stitched together from rags. Their teeth are rotted or missing entirely. The welfare officers try to speak with them. The children flinch. They huddle together. They look to the adults for permission before answering even the simplest questions. One officer notices a young girl, maybe 7 years old, with clouded eyes. She's blind. Another child, a boy around 9, has severe facial deformities. His head is shaped wrong. His ears don't match. He rocks back and forth constantly, humming the same note over and over. The adults are defensive but not aggressive. They claim everything is fine. They say the children are homeschooled. They say they prefer to live off the grid, away from society's corruption. When asked about medical care, they say they don't believe in doctors. When asked about the children's fathers, the women provide names: backpackers, tourists, men passing through looking for work. The officers don't believe them, but without immediate evidence of abuse, they can't remove the children. They leave with a warning: get the kids enrolled in school, improve the living conditions, or face consequences. The Colt family nods, agrees, promises to comply, and the officers drive away, deeply unsettled but bound by protocol. That would be the biggest mistake authorities would make. 1 month later, police return with a convoy: 4-wheel drives, a bus, an ambulance, and a court order. This time, they're not asking permission. On July 18, 2012, 12 children are removed from the camp. As officers load them into vehicles, the adults watch in silence. No one cries, no one protests. They just stare, as if they'd been expecting this day for 40 years. The children are taken to hospitals in Sydney. What doctors discover will shock even the most experienced child abuse specialists. 11 of the 12 children are the product of incest, not distant cousins, not second-generation relatives. Direct incest, fathers with daughters, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces. The genetic testing reveals something even more horrifying. This isn't the first generation, or the second. This is at least the 4th generation of systematic inbreeding. The family tree, when finally constructed by investigators, looks less like a tree and more like a tangle. Names repeat. Relationships loop back on themselves. Children are simultaneously siblings, cousins, aunts, and nephews. One child's DNA shows that his parents were brother and sister, both of whom were also the products of brother-sister incest. The genetic load is catastrophic. The children's medical issues aren't accidental. They're inevitable. When authorities ask the oldest children about their lives, the stories they tell are beyond comprehension. The origin. The Colt family story begins in New Zealand in the 1940s. A woman named June Colt was born in 1948, the product of a sexual relationship between her own mother and her mother's brother. June herself was the result of incest. She grew up knowing only what her family taught her, that outsiders couldn't be trusted, that family loyalty was everything, that blood bonds were sacred. In 1966, at age 18, June married a man named Tim Colt. Tim was not related to her. He was an outsider, brought into the family fold. Together, June and Tim had 7 children: Rhonda, Betty, Cherry, Frank, Charlie, Paula, and Martha. In the 1970s, the family emigrated from New Zealand to Australia, settling first in South Australia, then moving to Victoria, then Western Australia. They never stayed anywhere long. Locals would later say the Colts were nomadic, restless, always packing up and disappearing before anyone could get too close. By the 1980s, the second generation had reached adulthood, and that's when the pattern truly began. Tim and June's children, now in their 20s, did not marry outsiders. They did not leave the family. Instead, they turned inward. Brothers and sisters formed sexual relationships. Fathers began having children with their daughters. The family became a closed loop. Betty Colt, one of June's daughters, would become the matriarch after June's death in 2001. Betty had 12 children. DNA testing would later reveal that all 12 were fathered by her own brother, Charlie. But the testing also suggested that some may have been fathered by her father, Tim, before his death in 2009. Betty's daughter, Martha, had 5 children. Court documents revealed that Martha's children were likely fathered by a combination of her brother, Charlie, her own father, Tim, and possibly another brother. The family tree had become so tangled that even geneticists struggled to map it accurately. The third generation continued the pattern. By the time the family was discovered in 2012, there were at least 40 members spread across 4 generations, all descended from June and Tim Colt, all interconnected through decades of incest. The family supported themselves through welfare payments, disability benefits, family support, child allowances. They collected checks under multiple names, moved between states to avoid detection, and lived off the grid to ensure no government agency could track them effectively. They occasionally performed as a musical band, originally formed by Tim Colt, playing at local events and fairs. Locals who saw them perform described the family as odd but harmless. No one suspected what was happening behind closed doors, or rather, behind no doors at all, since the family lived in tents. The children were taught from birth that the outside world was dangerous, that schools were brainwashing institutions, that doctors were government spies, that anyone outside the family would try to separate them, destroy them, erase their way of life. And so the children stayed. They grew up. They had children of their own. And the cycle continued. Life in the camp. When forensic teams finally examined the Colt family camp after the children were removed, what they found was a snapshot of medieval squalor in 21st century Australia. The homes were makeshift structures, rotted caravans with collapsed roofs, tents held together with duct tape, sheds built from scavenged materials. None had insulation. In winter, temperatures dropped below freezing. In summer, the metal structures became ovens. There was no plumbing, no toilets. Human waste was buried in shallow pits or left to decompose in open trenches. The smell, officers reported, was overwhelming. A combination of sewage, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. The children slept on the ground or on filthy mattresses crawling with insects. There were no beds, no privacy. Siblings of all ages slept together in piles like animals. Food was scarce and irregular. The family survived on whatever they could hunt, scavenge, or buy with welfare payments. Meals consisted of canned goods, stale bread, and occasionally wild game. The children showed signs of chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, brittle bones, vitamin deficiencies. Medical care was non-existent. When children were sick or injured, they were left to recover on their own, or die. One child had a broken arm that had healed incorrectly, leaving the limb twisted and useless. Another had severe dental decay. Several teeth had rotted completely and fallen out without ever being seen by a dentist. Education was a concept that didn't exist. The children could not read or write. Most could barely speak. They communicated through grunts, gestures, and a limited vocabulary of perhaps 50 words. When asked their ages, they didn't know. When asked their birthdays, they looked confused. Time, as the outside world understood it, had no meaning in the camp. But the most disturbing aspect of life in the Colt camp wasn't the squalor or the neglect. It was the sexual abuse. According to testimony given by the older children after they were removed, sexual activity was normalized within the family. Children as young as 5 were exposed to adult sexual behavior. By age 10 or 11, most children were actively participating in sexual acts, either with other children or with adults. The children didn't understand that this was wrong. They had never been taught boundaries. They had never been told that families in the outside world didn't behave this way. To them, this was normal. This was love. This was what family did. One girl testified that she would hide in the bushes to avoid her brothers, who would chase her and force themselves on her. She said her mother, Betty, not only knew about this, but encouraged it. Betty told her daughters that it was their duty to keep the family strong, that outsiders would ruin them, that this was how families were meant to be. Another child described being tied to a tree by older boys and assaulted. When he told his mother, she slapped him and told him to stop lying. The abuse wasn't a secret. It was an open, accepted part of daily life. The children also exhibited disturbing behaviors that shocked even experienced child psychologists. They tortured animals, catching possums, wallabies, and feral cats, then mutilating their genitals as a form of entertainment. They engaged in violent play that mimicked sexual acts. When placed in foster care, several children immediately attempted to initiate sexual contact with their caregivers or other foster children. It took months of intensive therapy before the children began to understand that what had happened to them was not normal, that they had been victims, that the world outside the camp operated under different rules. But even then, many struggled. The programming ran deep. Several children, even after years in foster care, still defended their family, still insisted that what happened in the camp was love, still asked when they could go home. The investigation into the Colt family became one of the most complex child abuse cases in Australian history. Detectives had to untangle 4 generations of systematic incest, identify perpetrators, gather evidence, and build cases that would stand up in court, all while protecting the identities of the victims. The first challenge was establishing paternity. The women in the Colt family had initially claimed that their children were fathered by outsiders, backpackers, tourists, men passing through the area looking for seasonal work. They provided names, descriptions, even backstories. But DNA testing revealed these stories were fabrications. Every child tested except one was the product of incest between close biological relatives. In some cases, the exact relationship couldn't be determined because the genetic markers overlapped too much. A child might be the offspring of a father-daughter relationship, or an uncle-niece relationship, or a brother-sister relationship. The DNA was too tangled to say for certain. Investigators interviewed the children extensively. The interviews were heartbreaking. The children spoke matter-of-factly about things no child should ever experience. They described sexual acts with the clinical detachment of someone describing a chore. They didn't cry. They didn't express anger. They simply reported what had happened as if reading from a script. One 12-year-old girl named Tammy, a court-appointed pseudonym, told investigators she had been sexually abused by multiple family members since age 5. She said her mother, Betty, had forbidden her from seeking medical treatment when she became pregnant at age 13. She said her brothers would compete to see who could assault her first each day. She said she tried to run away once, but was caught and tied to a tree for 3 days as punishment. Tammy also revealed that she had been in a relationship with her brother for the past 3 years. She spoke about this relationship as if it were normal, even romantic. She said they loved each other, that they planned to have children together, that they wanted to get married. When investigators gently explained that this was illegal, that this was abuse, Tammy became defensive. She insisted she wasn't being abused. She said the outside world didn't understand, that her family had their own rules, that she was happy. It was a stark reminder of how deeply the conditioning ran. Meanwhile, forensic teams searched the camp. They found disturbing evidence. makeshift marital beds where adult siblings openly shared sleeping spaces, carvings on trees that marked territories for different family members, and journals kept by some of the adults that detailed their sexual activities with clinical precision. One journal, belonging to Betty Colt, contained entries that read like breeding records. She had documented which family members had sexual contact with which children, noting dates, frequency, and whether pregnancies resulted. She wrote about her children and grandchildren the way a farmer might write about livestock. Cell phone records provided additional evidence. Text messages between Betty and her son Bobby showed them planning to abduct one of Bobby's children from foster care. The messages were sexually explicit, discussing not only the kidnapping but also their plans to resume their sexual relationship once they were together again. By mid-2013, authorities had enough evidence to press charges against 8 members of the Colt family: Betty, Charlie, Rhonda, Roderick, Martha, Derek, Cliff, and Raylene. The charges included incest, sexual assault of minors, child neglect, perjury, and perverting the course of justice. The trials would drag on for years, complicated by the defendants' cognitive disabilities, their lack of education, and their genuine inability to understand why what they'd done was wrong. They weren't mentally ill in the clinical sense. They were simply products of a system that had existed for so long it had become their reality. The trials, the court proceedings, revealed just how warped the Colt family's understanding of reality had become. Martha Colt, one of Betty's daughters, was tried first. She was charged with lying about the paternity of her 5 children. During the trial, DNA evidence proved that her children had been fathered by at least 3 different biological relatives: her brother Charlie, her father Tim, and possibly another brother. Martha showed no remorse. She testified that she had never been taught that incest was wrong. She said her family had their own beliefs, their own values, and that the court had no right to impose outside morality on them. She described her relationships with her father and brothers as loving and consensual. When the judge asked if she understood that these relationships had harmed her children, that the genetic damage was evident in their disabilities, Martha replied that disabilities were God's will, not the result of incest. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Betty Colt's trial was even more disturbing. Betty, the matriarch who had orchestrated much of the family's activities after her mother June's death, showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. She sat calmly, hands folded, as prosecutors detailed decades of systematic abuse. Evidence showed that Betty had not only participated in incestuous relationships, but had actively encouraged them. She had arranged sexual pairings between her children. She had punished children who resisted. She had told her daughters that pregnancy was their duty, and that seeking medical help was betrayal. When asked why she had lived this way, Betty gave an answer that chilled the courtroom. Because this is what family does. Family stays together. Family takes care of family. The outside world tears families apart. We stayed pure. The word pure would haunt investigators for years. To Betty, purity meant keeping bloodlines undiluted by outsiders. It meant maintaining total control. It meant ensuring that no one could ever leave, because leaving meant mixing with the corrupted world beyond the camp. Betty was found guilty on multiple counts, but due to her cognitive disabilities and the fact that she had been raised in the same system she perpetuated, her sentence was controversial. She served time, but far less than many believed she deserved. Other family members faced similar outcomes. Some charges were dropped due to lack of evidence or witnesses who refused to testify. Some defendants were found mentally unfit to stand trial. Some received light sentences because they too were victims, born into a system they never chose and never questioned. The court struggled with an uncomfortable truth. How do you punish people who genuinely don't understand that what they did was wrong? How do you hold accountable individuals who are themselves victims of generational abuse? There were no easy answers. And as the trials concluded, many Australians were left with a sense of incomplete justice. The perpetrators had been identified, charged, and sentenced. But the true architect of the Colt family's horror, the ideology, the isolation, the systematic grooming that spanned 40 years, couldn't be put on trial. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments, how do you punish someone who was raised to believe abuse was normal? The children today. The 12 children removed from the Colt camp in 2012 faced a long, difficult road to recovery. Most are now adults. Their stories remain protected by court-ordered anonymity, but the general outcomes paint a picture of both resilience and ongoing struggle. In the first months after removal, the children exhibited severe behavioral issues. They were sexually aggressive with other children in foster care, sometimes attempting to initiate inappropriate contact with caregivers. They had no concept of personal boundaries, hygiene, or privacy. They couldn't use toilets properly. They didn't know how to brush their teeth. They ate with their hands and hoarded food in their rooms, terrified it would be taken away. They flinched at loud noises and hid when strangers approached. The educational challenges were immense. Most children were functionally illiterate well into their teenage years. Simple concepts like counting, telling time, or identifying colors required months of intensive teaching. They had never seen a television, used a computer, or played with manufactured toys. Psychologically, the damage was profound. The children struggled with attachment disorders, unable to trust caregivers or form healthy relationships. They experienced night terrors, flashbacks, and dissociative episodes. Several required psychiatric hospitalization, but perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was their confusion about what had happened to them. For years, many children insisted they hadn't been abused. They defended their family. They asked repeatedly when they could go home. They didn't understand why they'd been taken away from the only life they'd ever known. Therapists worked slowly to help them understand that families in the outside world didn't function the way the Colt family had. That sexual contact between family members wasn't normal, that they hadn't done anything wrong by existing, but that what had been done to them was deeply wrong. Some children adapted better than others. A few thrived in foster care, eventually attending school, making friends, and building relatively normal lives. They learned to read and write. They developed hobbies. They began to imagine futures that extended beyond survival. Others struggled profoundly. The genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding meant that several children faced lifelong disabilities, intellectual impairments, sensory deficits, chronic health issues. Some would never be able to live independently, and some, even years later, remained loyal to the family ideology. They maintained contact with adult relatives who weren't incarcerated. They spoke longingly of the camp, of the simplicity of that life, of the certainty that came from knowing exactly where you belonged. This loyalty troubled social workers. It suggested that the psychological conditioning ran so deep that even extensive therapy couldn't fully undo it. The children had been raised in a closed system with its own logic, its own morality, its own truth, and for some, that truth remained more powerful than anything the outside world could offer. Where are they now? The adult members of the Colt family who weren't imprisoned have largely disappeared back into Australian society. Court-ordered suppression orders protect their identities and locations, ostensibly to shield the children from further trauma. Betty Colt was released from a deportation center in November 2015 after fighting efforts to send her back to New Zealand, her country of birth. She's reportedly living in South Australia with her daughter Raylene and at least 3 male relatives. What they do, how they live, whether they've maintained contact with other family members, all of this remains unknown. Some family members attempted to re-establish contact with the children who'd been removed. Courts blocked these efforts repeatedly, citing the children's need for stability and the adults' history of manipulation. But enforcement is difficult, especially as the children age out of the foster system and gain legal autonomy. There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that some of the younger generation have reconnected with older relatives, that they've sought out the family members who raised them, drawn by bonds that outsiders can't fully understand. Social workers fear that without lifetime supervision, the cycle could begin again. The Colt family camp itself was demolished. The land was cleared, the tents and shacks burned, the remnants buried. Today, nothing marks the spot where 40 people lived in squalor for years, where children were born into abuse, where a system of systematic incest operated in plain sight, or rather, in complete invisibility, for 4 decades. Locals in the area rarely speak about the case. When they do, it's in hushed tones with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. How could this happen in modern Australia? How could 40 people live in such extreme isolation without anyone noticing? How could children suffer for years without a single teacher, doctor, or neighbor raising alarm? The answers are uncomfortable. The Colt family moved constantly, evading detection by design. They homeschooled, avoiding educational institutions. They rejected medical care, avoiding doctors. They collected welfare through multiple names and addresses, making themselves hard to track. And they lived in rural areas where people minded their own business. where strange families were dismissed as eccentric rather than investigated. In some ways, the Colt case exposed cracks in Australia's child protection system. The warning signs were there: children not attending school, welfare fraud, reports of unsanitary conditions. But bureaucratic silos, limited resources, and the sheer remoteness of the family's location meant that no one connected the dots until it was far too late. Since 2012, the case has been used in training materials for child protection agencies across Australia. It's studied by social workers, psychologists, and law enforcement as an example of how extreme isolation combined with generational abuse can create self-perpetuating systems of horror. But it's also sparked uncomfortable conversations about cultural relativism, family autonomy, and the limits of state intervention. The Colt family believed they were living according to their own values, their own rules. They didn't see themselves as abusers. They saw themselves as a family unit maintaining its integrity against a hostile outside world. Does that belief excuse what happened? Of course not. But it complicates the narrative. It forces us to ask, how do we identify and intervene in closed systems before they reach the point of the Colt family? How do we balance respect for family privacy with the need to protect vulnerable children? And how do we help victims of generational abuse who don't see themselves as victims at all? The Colt family case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of what can happen when a family turns completely inward, rejecting all outside influence, creating its own reality, its own morality, its own truth. It's tempting to dismiss the Colts as an aberration, a uniquely twisted family that could never be replicated. But the reality is more unsettling. Cases of isolated families practicing systematic incest have been documented around the world. The Fritzl family in Austria, the Goller clan in Canada, the Turpin family in California. The patterns are always the same: extreme isolation, religious or ideological justification, generations of victims who become perpetrators, children who don't know that another way of life exists. The Colt family is unusual only in its scale and duration. 4 generations, 40 people, decades of systematic abuse. But the psychology, the isolation, the self-perpetuating cycle, these elements appear again and again in families that cut themselves off from society. And that's what makes this case so important to remember. Not because it's sensational or shocking, but because it teaches us what happens when warning signs are ignored, when isolation goes unchecked, when victims have no voice and no one listening. The 12 children who were removed from the Colt camp in 2012 are adults now, or nearly so. Their lives have been marked by trauma, but also by survival. They escaped a system designed to trap them forever. They learned that a different world exists beyond the camp. Some have thrived, some have struggled, some may never fully recover. But they're alive, they're free, and they have the chance to write their own stories, rather than repeating the story that was written for them 4 generations ago. As for the rest of the Colt family, those who weren't imprisoned, those who disappeared back into Australian society, those who still believe their way of life was right, we may never know what became of them. But somewhere in rural Australia, there are people living under different names, carrying DNA that tells a story of 4 generations of darkness. People who remember a camp in the bush where family meant everything and the outside world meant nothing. And we're left with a question that has no comfortable answer. Are there other families like the Colt still out there, still hidden, still operating in the shadows where authorities can't see them? The answer, unfortunately, is almost certainly yes. If this story has affected you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think should happen to families like the Colts. Tell us how we can protect children in isolated communities. And subscribe to Lost History Docs, because the stories that make us most uncomfortable are often the stories we need to hear most. Remember their names, not the perpetrators, but the victims, the 12 children who survived, and the countless others in families we haven't discovered yet, who are still waiting to be found. The past isn't buried. It's living in a tent, somewhere in the bush, teaching the next generation that this is what family means.